The retina is made up of 6 layers. Light must pass through 5 layers before reaching the photoreceptor layer. Absorption of light stimulates a chemical reaction in the discs of the photoreceptors, thus creating an electrical impulse. There are 2 types of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Cones are necessary for perception of color and visual form and are most dense in the fovea. Rods are necessary for the perception of movement, depth of vision, and small differences in brightness. Rods are absent from the fovea and are most dense in the perifoveal area. Once the electrical impulse has been initiated within the rods and cones, it travels along the length of these cells, which synapse with bipolar cells in the outer plexiform layer. The bipolar cells then synapse with the ganglion cells in the inner plexiform layer. Ganglion cell axons are non-myelinated and carry the impulse along the inner surface of the eye towards the optic disc, where the cell axons pass between the fine collagen bundles of the lamina cribrosa as they leave the eye. At this point, the axons become myelinated and collectively form the optic nerve. The optic nerve is surrounded by the meninges and passes through the optic canal to exit the orbit. The optic canal opens into the middle cranial fossa. The temporal retinal fibers course laterally and do not decussate, while the nasal retinal fibers decussate and join the temporal retinal fibers of the contralateral eye. At this point, the optic tract is formed, with each tract composed of the ipsilateral temporal retinal fibers and the contralateral nasal retinal fibers. The majority of the optic tract loops around the cerebral peduncle to enter the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Here, the optic tract fibers synapse with the third-order sensory neurons, whose cell bodies are located within the lateral geniculate nucleus. The axons of these third-order neurons form the optic radiation, which relays the visual information to the primary visual cortex. The majority of the primary visual cortex is located on the medial surface of the occipital lobe along the calcarine fissure, with the remainder located on the posterior surface of the lobe. The axons within the optic radiation follow the contour of the lateral wall of the lateral ventricle. They retain retinoptic organization, forming a superior, intermediate, and inferior division. The superior division, also known as Baum's loop, conveys information from the superior retinal quadrants, and therefore from the inferior visual field. The intermediate division relays information from the macular region of the visual field. The inferior division, also known as Mayer's loop, courses posteriorly within the temporal lobe, looping around the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Mayer's loop relays information from the inferior retinal quadrants, and therefore from the superior visual field. The primary visual cortex projects to the secondary visual cortex. Here, information is processed and projected to the association visual cortex. Impulses then travel to the parietal lobe via the dorsal pathway or to the temporal lobe via the ventral pathway. The dorsal pathway is concerned with spatial vision. The ventral pathway is concerned with object recognition.